The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Montana wilderness, each flake a whisper of the heaven that Sarah Mackenzie thought she'd never see again. She sat on the porch of the log cabin, her cream-colored dress stained with mud and blood, her hands trembling not from the cold but from everything she had survived. The man kneeling before her, his long silver hair falling across shoulders that had carried the weight of 2 lifetimes, held her hands as if they were made of something more precious than gold. His name was Thomas Gray Wolf, and he had just asked her a question that would change everything. But to understand why tears streamed down her weathered face, why her heart hammered against her ribs like a wild Mustang against a corral fence, you have to understand what brought them to this moment, to this cabin, to this impossible choice between love and survival. Sarah had arrived in Montana Territory 3 years earlier with nothing but a wagon, a dream, and a husband who promised her a new life. James Mackenzie had been a convincing man, the kind who could sell water to a river, and he'd painted pictures of their future with words that sparkled like fool's gold. They would have land, he said. They would build an empire, he promised. They would grow old watching their children play in fields of wheat that stretched to the horizon. But James Mackenzie was better at making promises than keeping them, and within 6 months of their arrival, Sarah learned that her husband's talents lay not in farming or building, but in gambling and drinking whiskey until he couldn't remember his own name. The cabin they'd built together stood crooked on its foundation, a testament to James's lack of skill and abundance of pride. He refused help from their neighbors, refused to learn from the men who'd survived these mountains for generations, refused everything except the bottle and the card tables in town. Sarah had tried to hold things together, tried to plant gardens and preserve food and prepare for the brutal winters that everyone warned her about. She tried to be the wife that James needed, but you can't save a man who's determined to drown, and James Mackenzie was sinking faster than a stone in a river. Thomas Gray Wolf had appeared in her life like a ghost materializing from the morning mist. He was half Lakota, half Irish, and fully alone in a world that didn't quite know what to make of men who straddled 2 cultures. His mother had been a healer, his father a fur trapper who'd loved her enough to leave his own people behind. Thomas had inherited his mother's wisdom and his father's wandering spirit, making his living as a tracker and guide for settlers who were smart enough to admit they needed help navigating this unforgiving wilderness. Sarah's husband had not been that smart. The first time Thomas came to their cabin, James was 3 days into a bender in town, and Sarah was trying to repair a section of roof that had caved in under an early snow. She was balanced precariously on a ladder that had seen better days, hammering at boards with nails clenched between her teeth, when she heard a voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was deep and calm, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud. He told her the ladder was going to break. He told her she was doing it wrong. He told her to come down before she killed herself. Sarah, who'd spent 3 years being told what to do by a man who couldn't do anything right himself, told him in very colorful language exactly where he could go and what he could do when he got there. Thomas had laughed. It was the first time Sarah had heard genuine laughter in longer than she could remember, and something about that sound made her anger deflate like a punctured water skin. She came down the ladder, more because she was curious about this strange man than because she was following his orders, and found herself looking up into eyes that seemed to hold both the sky and the earth. He introduced himself, told her he'd been hired by the territorial government to check on remote homesteads before winter set in hard, and asked if she needed help. Sarah, who needed help more than she needed air, told him she was fine. Pride, she was learning, was a luxury she couldn't afford, but old habits die hard. Thomas didn't push. He simply asked if he could water his horse, and when Sarah agreed, he spent the next hour doing exactly that while also somehow managing to fix her roof, reinforce her chicken coop, and stack enough firewood to last her a week. He did all of this without a word, without asking permission, without making her feel like she owed him anything. When he finally mounted his horse to leave, he told her he'd be passing through again in a month, and if she needed anything, anything at all, she should leave a red cloth tied to the fence post by the road. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest like he'd never been there at all. Sarah didn't tie a red cloth to the fence post. She was determined to prove she could handle everything herself, that she didn't need rescue from some half-native stranger with kind eyes and capable hands. But the universe has a way of humbling the proud, and 2 weeks after Thomas's visit, James came home with more than a hangover. He brought with him 3 men he owed money to, men with hard faces and harder intentions, men who made it clear that James's debts would be paid one way or another. Sarah watched from the cabin as her husband tried to negotiate, tried to buy more time, tried everything except telling the truth, which was that they had nothing. The men had looked at the cabin, at the small plot of land, at Sarah standing in the doorway, and one of them had smiled in a way that made her blood run cold. That night, after the men had left with promises to return, Sarah had tied a red cloth to the fence post. She'd done it in the dark, her hands shaking, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same terrible ending. James had passed out inside, oblivious to the danger he'd brought to their door, snoring while Sarah sat up with his hunting rifle across her lap, watching the tree line and praying that Thomas Gray Wolf was a man of his word. He'd arrived before dawn, moving so quietly that Sarah didn't know he was there until he was standing in front of the porch, his horse a shadow behind him. He didn't ask questions. He looked at the red cloth, looked at Sarah's face, looked at the rifle in her hands, and understood everything he needed to know. He told her to pack what she couldn't replace, to gather any food and supplies she could carry, and to wake her husband. Sarah had started to explain, started to tell him about the men and the dead and the impossible situation, but Thomas had held up his hand and said 3 words that she would remember for the rest of her life. "I believe you." Getting James out of the cabin had been like trying to move a mountain with a spoon. He was angry, confused, belligerent, insisting that everything was fine, that Sarah was overreacting, that he'd handle the men when they came back. Thomas had listened to this for exactly 30 seconds before he'd grabbed James by the front of his shirt, lifted him nearly off his feet, and told him in a voice that could have frozen fire that he had 2 choices. He could come quietly and maybe survive what was coming, or he could stay and definitely not survive it. James, for once in his life, made the smart choice. Thomas took them to a place he called the High Meadow, a valley tucked so far back in the mountains that Sarah was certain no human had ever seen it before. There was a small cabin there, one that Thomas said had belonged to his father, built solid and true with the kind of craftsmanship that came from understanding the land you were building on. He told them they could stay until the trouble passed, until James figured out a way to settle his debts or until the men who were owed gave up looking. He provisioned them with supplies from his own cash, showed them where the spring was, where the best hunting could be found, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds and the behavior of the birds. Then he left, and Sarah found herself alone in the wilderness with a husband she no longer loved and a stranger's kindness she couldn't quite comprehend. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Sarah's life. Away from the bottle and the card tables, James seemed to wake up from the fog he'd been living in. He talked about making a fresh start, about being the man she'd married, about all the things he should have done differently. Sarah wanted to believe him. Part of her, the part that remembered falling in love with his smile and his promises, desperately wanted to believe that people could change. But another part of her, the part that had grown hard and wise through disappointment, knew better. Change didn't happen because of geography. It happened because of choice, and James Mackenzie had been making the same choices for too long. Thomas came to check on them every few days, always bringing supplies, always staying just long enough to make sure they were safe before disappearing back into the forest. Sarah found herself listening for the sound of his horse, found herself watching the tree line, found herself thinking thoughts that a married woman had no business thinking. She tried to fight it, tried to focus on her husband and their marriage and doing the right thing. But the heart wants what it wants, and Sarah's heart was beginning to want something she couldn't name. It was James who finally named it for her. One evening, after Thomas had left, James had looked at his wife with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in years and told her that he saw the way she looked at the tracker. He told her he didn't blame her. He told her that he'd wasted the gift of her love, that he'd taken a good woman and nearly destroyed her, that she deserved better than a man who couldn't stop destroying everything he touched. Sarah had tried to protest, tried to say that she was his wife and she'd made vows, but James had just smiled sadly and said that vows meant nothing if the man you made them to had already broken his half of the bargain 100 times over. The next morning, James was gone. He'd left a note saying he was going back to face the men he owed, that he was going to try to work off his debt honestly for once in his life, that Sarah should consider herself free of him. He asked her not to follow, not to try to find him, to just let him go and live the life she should have had all along. Sarah had stood in the cabin holding that note, tears streaming down her face, feeling a complicated mix of grief and relief that made her feel like the worst person in the world. Thomas had found her like that, standing frozen with the note in her hands, and for the first time since she'd met him, she'd seen anger in his eyes. Not at her, but at James, at the cowardice of running away, at the danger he'd put himself in, at the burden he'd left Sarah to carry. Thomas had gone after him, tracking him through snow that was beginning to fall in earnest, following a trail that was already starting to disappear. Sarah had waited in that cabin for 3 days, burning through firewood and prayers in equal measure, convinced that both men she cared about were going to die in the mountains and leave her alone. But Thomas had come back. He'd come back with frostbite on his fingers and exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and he'd told her that James was gone. Not dead, but gone. He'd found him at a mining camp 2 days' ride away, already signing papers to work off his debt in the mines, already starting the hard work of becoming someone different. James had sent a message through Thomas, releasing Sarah from their marriage, asking her to forgive him, telling her to be happy. Thomas had delivered this message in a voice that was carefully neutral, and then he'd asked Sarah what she wanted to do. That's when Sarah had realized something that should have terrified her but instead filled her with a strange peace. She didn't want to go back to the crooked cabin and the life she'd built on James's broken promises. She didn't want to return to being the woman who waited for a man to remember she existed. She wanted to stay in this valley, in this solid cabin built by hands that understood their work. She wanted to learn how to read the weather and track game and survive in a wilderness that was harsh but honest. She wanted to wake up every morning knowing that the person she shared her life with would be there, would be present, would be real. She wanted Thomas Gray Wolf. Saying it out loud had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. Sarah Mackenzie, raised proper in Philadelphia, taught that a woman's worth was measured by her husband's success in her own silence, found herself standing in a mountain cabin telling a man she barely knew that she wanted to build a life with him. She told him she understood if he didn't feel the same way, that she was grateful for everything he'd done, that she would find her own way forward regardless. She told him all of this while staring at the floor, unable to meet his eyes, certain that she was making a fool of herself. Thomas had crossed the cabin in 2 strides and tilted her chin up with fingers that were gentle despite their strength. He told her that he'd been half in love with her since the day he saw her on that broken ladder, cursing at the sky and refusing to quit even when anyone sensible would have given up. He told her about the loneliness of walking between 2 worlds, never quite belonging to either, always watching life happen to other people. He told her that she made him feel like he could stop wandering, like he'd found a place to rest, like home was a person instead of a place. Then he'd kissed her, and Sarah discovered that starting over didn't have to mean forgetting everything that came before. It just meant choosing something better. They'd spent the winter in the high meadow, learning each other the way you learn a new language, with patience and mistakes and moments of perfect understanding. Thomas taught her how to hunt and trap, how to cure hides and preserve meat, how to listen to the forest and understand what it was telling her. Sarah taught him about books and music, about the world beyond the mountains, about the dreams she'd carried west that had nothing to do with James and everything to do with becoming someone she could be proud of. They worked together to winterize the cabin, to stock the stores, to prepare for the harshest months with the kind of partnership that Sarah had always imagined marriage should be but never was. Spring had come slowly, reluctantly, melting the snow 1 inch at a time and revealing the valley in all its wild beauty. With it came the question of what happened next. Thomas had lands to the south, a place his mother's people had helped him claim, where he'd been building his own future before Sarah entered his life. He wanted to take her there, to show her the home he'd been preparing, to build something permanent together. But first, he said, there was something he needed to do properly. So he'd brought her back to the crooked cabin, the one she'd shared with James, the place where her old life had ended. It was still standing, barely, leaning a little more to the left than she remembered. Thomas had spent 2 days making it right, fixing the foundation, straightening the walls, replacing the boards that had rotted through. He did this not because they were going to live there, but because Sarah deserved to leave her past behind on her own terms, with her head held high. And now here they were, on the porch of that cabin, with snow falling like a benediction and Thomas Gray Wolf on his knees before her. He wasn't asking her to marry him exactly. The law said she was still married to James, and it would be years before that could be unwound properly. But he was making her a promise, one that he sealed with a ring he'd carved himself from elk antler, with symbols from his mother's people intertwined with patterns from his father's homeland. He was promising to be her partner, her companion, her home for as long as they both had breath in their bodies. He was promising to build a life where she would never have to tie a red cloth to a fence post, where she would never have to wonder if she was worth fighting for, where every day would be proof that she had made the right choice. Sarah looked at this man kneeling in the mud, at his silver hair that caught the snowflakes like a crown, at his hands that could track a ghost through stone but held hers like she was made of light. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, stepping off a wagon with dreams that were really someone else's dreams. She thought about the woman she'd become, hard and wise and stronger than she'd ever imagined. And she thought about the woman she was going to be, standing next to this improbable man, building an improbable life in a wilderness that didn't care about society's rules or proper behavior or anything except survival and truth. She said yes. Of course she said yes. She said yes while crying and laughing at the same time, said yes while pulling him up from his knees, said yes while kissing him with snow melting in their hair and the whole world watching. She said yes to frontier love under winter skies, to a future written in hard work and honest partnership, to a life that would never be easy but would always be real. She said yes to Thomas Gray Wolfe, and in doing so, she said yes to Sarah Mackenzie, to the woman who'd survived and the woman who was just beginning to truly live. They left the crooked cabin standing there in the snow, a monument to everything Sarah had endured and everything she was leaving behind. Thomas helped her onto his horse, swinging up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. They rode south toward his lands, toward their future, toward a life that would be full of hard winters and hungry wolves and all the challenges that came with choosing to make a home in wild places. But they rode together, and that made all the difference. As they disappeared into the forest, the snow covered their tracks, erasing all evidence that they'd been there at all. The cabin stood silent and empty, its crooked walls straightened but its stories locked inside, waiting for someone else to come along and try to build their own impossible dreams. And somewhere in the mountains, in a valley that appeared on no maps, a new story was beginning. Not the story Sarah had imagined when she came west, not the fairy tale she'd been promised. Something better. Something true. Something that belonged entirely to her and the man who'd knelt in the snow to offer her the rest of his days. Frontier love under winter skies, where a cowboy kneels for his woman, and together they rise to meet whatever comes next.